I killed Elias Miller for 300 acres of Kansas dirt. It wasn't with a gun or a blade, but with a fountain pen and a practiced look of professional sympathy that I had spent 40 years perfecting behind a mahogany desk. People in this town call me a pillar of the community. They see the retired bank manager who still attends Sunday service and tips well at the diner. They see a man who aged gracefully, whose hands are clean, and whose conscience, they assume, is as clear as the prairie sky. They don't see the ledger I keep in my head. They don't see the ink stains on my soul that no amount of prayer can scrub away. It was 1994. The Midwest was choking on a drought that felt less like weather and more like a divine grudge. The dust didn't just sit on the windowsills. It got into your teeth, your clothes, the very way you thought about the future. Elias came into my office on a Tuesday. I remember the smell of him, diesel, sweat, and the desperate scent of a man who hadn't slept in 3 days. He sat across from me, his hat in his lap, picking at a loose thread on his knee. His hands were the color of the earth he was losing, deep, cracked brown, with grease settled into the lifelines of his palms. "Arthur," he said, his voice like gravel grinding together, "the rains are coming. The almanac says 3 weeks. I just need the extension on the seasonal, just 60 days. I looked at his file. I didn't need to. I knew his numbers better than he did. I knew his yield was down 40%. I knew his wife, Sarah, had been taking extra shifts at the infirmary just to keep the lights on. And I knew that his land, 300 acres of the finest silt loam in the county, shared a northern border with the property my grandfather had settled. I told him the board was tightening the belt. I told him the federal regulations had changed since the last quarter. I lied. The truth was, I had the acquisition papers already drafted in the bottom drawer of my desk. I had looked at that map for years, seeing his acreage as the missing piece of a legacy I wanted to build. My family had always been almost wealthy. With Elias's land, we would be the owners of the valley. Oh. "There's nothing I can do, Elias," I said. I even managed to make my voice crack a little, as if the decision were hurting me too. He didn't yell, he didn't plead. He just looked at me with those pale blue eyes, eyes that had watched the horizon for rain for 30 years. And he nodded. It was a slow, heavy movement of the head, like a man accepting a death sentence. "I understand," he whispered. He stood up, put his hat back on, and walked out. He left a faint smudge of dust on the arm of the guest chair. I waited until the door clicked shut, then I pulled out the draft for the foreclosure. I told myself I was doing the land a favor. Elias was old-fashioned. He was inefficient. Under my management, that soil would breathe again. I'd bring in modern irrigation. I'd rotate the crops properly. I was a steward of progress. That's the lie you tell yourself when you're carving a piece out of another man's heart. You tell yourself you're a surgeon, not a butcher. 3 nights later, the sky didn't bring rain. It stayed that bruised, heavy purple color, holding its breath. I was sitting on my porch, sipping a scotch, looking toward the north. Then I saw it, a flicker, a low orange pulse on the horizon. At first, I thought it was the heat lightning we'd been seeing all week, but it didn't disappear. It grew. It blossomed into a terrifying bright flower of gold and crimson right where Elias's main barn stood. I didn't call the fire department right away. I sat there for a full minute, watching the glow, calculating the insurance, the loss of structures, the drop in property value. I was still thinking in percentages while a man was losing everything he had ever touched. By the time the siren started wailing through the valley, the barn was a skeleton of fire. The heat was so intense, it was said to have melted the bells on the cows in the nearby paddock. And Elias hadn't tried to save the livestock. He hadn't tried to pull the tractor out. He had walked into the center of the hayloft with a can of accelerant and a single match. And the sheriff told me later they found him sitting in an old rocking chair he'd moved into the middle of the floor. He went down with his ship. The funeral was a quiet, suffocating affair. The air in the church was thick with the scent of lilies and old wood, but all I could smell was the char of that barn. I sat in the third pew, my hands folded, looking at the back of Sarah's head. She looked smaller than I remembered, her shoulders hunched as if she were trying to occupy as little space as possible. People shook my hand afterward. They told me how sorry they were for my loss. You and Elias were like brothers, they said, best friends for 40 years. I nodded and swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I played the part of the grieving survivor. I even squeezed Sarah's hand and told her I'd take care of everything. She looked at me with eyes that were terrifyingly vacant, a hollowed-out version of the woman who used to bring me lemonade when I visited their porch. 6 weeks later, the paperwork was finalized. The bank moved to seize the property, and because the structures were gone and the value had plummeted, I stepped in with a private offer. It was technically legal. I followed every procedure to the letter, ensuring the bank's interests were met while securing the deed for myself. I bought 300 acres for less than the price of a mid-sized sedan. The day I signed the final documents, I felt a surge of triumph that lasted exactly 3 minutes. Then the silence of my office began to ring. I went out to the property the following morning. The drought had finally broken, not with a gentle rain, but with a violent, cleansing storm that had turned the dust into thick black sludge. I stood at the edge of the blackened footprint where the barn had been. The land should have been thirsty. It should have been drinking. But as I walked across the north pasture, my pasture now, I noticed something wrong. The water wasn't soaking in. It was pooling on the surface, slick and oily, running off the slopes in strange, jagged patterns. The grass that remained wasn't turning green. It was turning a pale, sickly gray like ash. I told myself it was the chemical runoff from the fire. I told myself the soil was just overworked. I spent thousands on fertilizers, on soil specialists from the university, on state-of-the-art irrigation systems. They all told me the same thing. The pH was fine. The minerals were balanced. Technically, that land was perfect for corn. but nothing grew. I planted 200 acres of premium seed. I watched my neighbors' fields erupt in vibrant, waist-high stalks, a sea of green that whispered in the wind. My fields stayed bare, a vast brown scar in the middle of the valley. It was as if the earth itself had decided to stop breathing the moment Elias's heart stopped. I started sleeping less. I'd find myself driving out there at 2 a.m, sitting in my truck with the headlights cutting through the dark. I'd stare at that empty space, waiting for a sprout, a weed, a single blade of life. Nothing, just the wind whistling through the rusted remains of Elias's plow. Then there was the mail. Sarah moved out of the farmhouse a month after the funeral. She moved into a small apartment in the city 3 hours away. She didn't leave a forwarding address with the post office, only with me. "You were his best friend, Arthur," she'd said, her voice a ghost of itself. "You'll know what to do with the things that come for him." Most of it was junk, catalogs for farming equipment he'd never use, bills for a life that was over until the blue envelope arrived. It was tucked inside a larger packet of documents from a law firm in Topeka. It was dated 2 days before the fire, 2 days after I had denied him the loan. My hands shook as I opened it. I expected anger. I expected a curse. I expected him to tell me he knew why I'd really said no. Instead, I found a copy of a revised will and a handwritten note that made the air in my lungs turn to lead. "Arthur," it began, "I know the bank has its rules. I don't blame you for doing your job. A man has to protect his own." I had to stop reading. I had to go to the kitchen and pour a glass of water, but my hand wouldn't stop trembling. I sat at the table, the shadows of the evening lengthening across the floor, and I forced myself to finish it. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't hold on. I've left Sarah a little something in the city, but the land is the thing. It's been in my family since the 1880s, but we've got no sons to take it. And I know how much you've always loved that North Ridge. He had written it. He had intended to give it to me, not through a sale, not through a foreclosure. He was going to sign it over to me as a gift of stewardship, as long as I promised to look after Sarah if the drought broke him. He had been planning to come into the bank the following Monday to hand me the deed. I could have had the land for free. I could have had the land and my soul, but I had been too greedy to wait for a dying man's generosity. I didn't go to the city right away. I spent another month watching that gray, lifeless dirt, hoping for a miracle that I knew I didn't deserve. The bank had promoted me. I was the man who cleaned up the portfolio. I was a success on paper and a hollowed-out husk in my own skin. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that blue envelope. You'll know what to do. I finally drove to the city on a Tuesday, the same day of the week Elias had sat in my office. I had a check in my pocket for $50,000. It was nearly all the profit I'd made from the year's bonuses and the sale of my grandfather's smaller lot. I told myself it was restitution. I told myself it would make the scales balance. Sarah lived in a complex that smelled of boiled cabbage and industrial cleaner. When she opened the door, she didn't look surprised to see me. She looked tired, not the tiredness of a long day, but the exhaustion of a soul that had given up on the concept of mourning. "Arthur," she said. She didn't invite me in. She just stood there holding the door frame. "Sarah, I brought you something from the bank's late settlement fund." Another lie. I couldn't even give her the money without wrapping it in a professional deception. I held out the check. She didn't even look at the numbers. She just looked at my face, her eyes searching for something I had buried a long time ago. "He told me, you know," she whispered. My heart skipped a beat. The hallway felt suddenly narrow, the air thin. "Told you what?" "That morning, after he came back from seeing you. He sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours just looking at his hands. Then he said, 'Arthur's a good man. He's doing what's right for the town. If the bank says I'm done, then I'm done.'" She let out a small, dry laugh that sounded like dead leaves skittering on a sidewalk. "He believed in you more than he believed in the rain, Arthur. He said if he couldn't make the land work, he wanted you to have it, because you were the only one who understood what that dirt meant." I felt the check trembling between my fingers. "Sarah, please, take this. It's what he would have wanted." She pushed my hand away, gently. "He didn't want your money, Arthur. He wanted his friend. But he's gone now. And the land. I heard it's gone too." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice cracking. "The boys from the valley, they come by sometimes to check on me. They say nothing's growing on the Miller place, not even a thistle. They say it's like the ground just gave up." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the first spark of something sharp in her eyes. "What did you say to him in that office, Arthur? To make a man like Elias decide that fire was the only way out?" I couldn't answer. I turned and walked away. I heard the door click shut behind me, a soft final sound that echoed in my skull all the way back to the valley. When I got home, I didn't go into my house. I drove straight to the North Ridge. I climbed out of the truck and walked into the center of the dead field. It was midnight. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky. I knelt down and dug my fingers into the soil. It felt cold, unnaturally cold. And then I realized why the specialist couldn't find anything wrong with the pH or the minerals. I pulled up a handful of dirt and brought it to my nose. There was a faint metallic tang, salt. I moved 10 feet and dug again. Salt, 20 feet, salt. Elias hadn't just burned the barn. In those 3 days between our meeting and the fire, he had spent his nights hauling bags of rock salt, hundreds of them, and tilling them deep into the soil. He had systematically poisoned every square inch of the 300 acres. The realization hit me like a physical blow. He hadn't been protecting me. He hadn't been giving me the land. I sat there in the dirt, the salt stinging the small cuts on my fingers. I looked at my hands, the hands of a banker, a man who dealt in percentages and collateral, and I realized I had been looking at a masterpiece of sacrifice through the eyes of a thief. I went back to the truck and pulled the blue envelope from the dashboard. There was a second page I hadn't read, stuck to the back of the deed of gift, with a smear of old tractor grease. My flashlight beam flickered, struggling against the dark. Arthur, the letter continued, I know how the bank works. I know you did everything you could to fight for me. You've always been a man of honor, and I won't have your reputation ruined by my failure. I felt a coldness in my marrow that the night air couldn't account for. Elias didn't think I had betrayed him. He thought I was a victim of the system, just like him. He thought I was his only ally in a world of cold numbers. I'm going to make sure no one else bids on the North Ridge, the letter read. I'm going to make the land look worthless to the bank. That way you can buy it for pennies. You're the only one I trust to look after Sarah. Use the land to take care of her, Arthur. I know you'll make it green again when I'm gone. He hadn't salted the earth to spite me. He had salted the earth to save it for me. He had destroyed his family's legacy and taken his own life to create a loophole for a friend who was at that very moment plotting to steal his soil. He died believing I was a saint. He turned himself into ash so I could have the dirt he thought I loved. And in my greed, in my hurry to foreclose, I hadn't even given him the 60 days he'd asked for. 60 days. And he would have realized that salt doesn't just lower the price for a season. It kills the heart of the earth forever. I am 67 years old now. I still live in this valley. I never married. I never had the sons I wanted to pass this land to. And Sarah, she passed away in that city apartment 10 years ago. I tried to send her money every month. She sent every single check back, unopened, until the day she died. She never knew the truth, but she knew me. She knew the smell of a man who had built his house on a grave. Every morning I walk out to the North Ridge. The irrigation pipes I installed have rusted into orange skeletons. The tractors are husks. The neighbors have stopped asking why I don't sell. They think I'm a tragic figure, the loyal friend who can't let go of his partner's memory. They don't know that this is my prison. I own 300 acres of silence. I own a desert that I paid for, with the life of the only man who ever truly loved me. I look at the horizon and wait for the rain, but the rain doesn't matter anymore. The salt is too deep. It's in the water, it's in the wind, it's in the very way I breathe. I have everything I ever wanted, and I have absolutely nothing.